Ethan Walker gripped the worn-out steering wheel of his rusty pickup truck as he cruised down Highway 12 in rural Oregon. The late afternoon sky was a mix of gold and lilac, the kind of beauty that almost seemed to mock the silent chaos inside him. His life had fallen apart over the past 2 years, and everything he had left was now tossed onto the back seat. 2 backpacks, a box of tools, and his 7-year-old son, Liam, who stared quietly out the window with wide eyes. They were leaving Seattle behind, the city where Ethan had built a life with his wife, Rachel. But ever since the accident that took Rachel away from them, everything had started to crumble. First came the overdue bills, then the lost job, and finally, the eviction. Ethan had tried with everything he had to keep some kind of stability for Liam, but every effort just seemed to drag them deeper into the hole. Now, they were headed into the unknown, hanging on to a tip from an old acquaintance about a small town in southern Oregon called Cedar Valley, a place where time moved slower and people still valued hard work. "Dad," Liam's voice was hesitant. "Do you think this place is gonna be good?" Ethan gave him a half-smile, even though he wasn't sure about anything anymore. "I think so, buddy. It'll be different. And sometimes, different's all we need." But like the universe wasn't quite done testing his faith, the truck suddenly sputtered. A dry sound, followed by a loud pop. Ethan hit the brakes, and the truck lost power until it rolled to a stop on the shoulder of a dirt road, surrounded by hills and tall trees. He got out, feeling the heat of the asphalt rise through the soles of his boots as he popped the hood. It didn't take long to figure it out. Dead fuel pump. No cell signal, no town nearby, and the sun starting to dip behind the mountains. Ethan could feel the old despair creeping back in. That's when he heard the distant rumble of an engine. A dusty, tough-looking blue pickup was making its way slowly toward them. When it pulled up alongside them, a woman hopped out. She was wearing work boots, a worn-out plaid shirt, and an expression that was a mix of curiosity and caution. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her green eyes scanned the scene carefully. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. "Looks like the fuel pump's shot," Ethan said. "My boy and I are heading out looking for work, and maybe a little bit of luck, if there's any left." She glanced over at Liam, who was still sitting inside the truck, watching everything with wide eyes, and then looked back at Ethan. "I'm Grace Ellison. Got a farm just over the next hill. Don't have much to offer, but I do need someone who knows their way around tools. If you can handle some hard work, I can give you a place to stay till you get this truck fixed." Ethan hesitated. It sounded way too good to be true, and from experience, he knew these kinds of things usually came with a catch. But Liam's hopeful look just about broke him. "All right," he said, reaching out his hand. "Ethan Walker." Grace shook his hand firmly. "Let's get your truck towed. The guest house is empty." And right then, under a golden sky giving way to night, Ethan got the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they had finally landed in the right place. Grace's truck towed Ethan's old clunker up the road, slowly winding through the bends lined with open fields and rows of trees, swaying in the gentle breeze. Sitting beside her, Ethan gripped the seat tight as he looked out the window, trying to figure out who this quiet woman was who'd shown up like some kind of miracle at the most unlikely moment. Liam, squeezed between them on the front seat, was taking it all in with wide, amazed eyes. The landscape was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Rolling green and golden hills, rustic wooden fences, and a sky so clear you could see where the blue melted into lavender. "Is it always this quiet around here?" Ethan ventured. Grace shrugged, giving him a small half-smile. "Most of the time. Sometimes the cows get loose, or the tractors break down. But other than that, it's just quiet and work." "And you run all this by yourself?" "Been doing it on my own for a few years now." The answer was short, but not unfriendly. It was the kind of answer that didn't invite more questions, and Ethan got the hint. As they rounded a wider curve, the farm came into view, and what he saw took his breath away. An old wooden house with a wraparound porch, a barn out back that looked like it was ready to fall apart, and fields stretching out as far as the eye could see. There was also a tool shed, a small vegetable garden, and a pasture where a few cows were lazily grazing. "Wow," Liam whispered, clearly impressed. Grace parked the truck next to a smaller structure, its white paint peeling and a brick chimney poking out of the roof. The guest house. This is it. Not fancy, but it's got a bed, hot water, and a kitchen that still works. I already chopped some firewood for the heater. Ethan got out and helped Liam down. They were both exhausted, but there was something comforting about the place. Maybe it was the simplicity or the feeling that finally no one expected anything from them except honesty and hard work. "I don't usually bring strangers onto my property," Grace said, watching as Ethan unloaded the backpacks from the truck. "But you showed up right when I really needed a hand." Ethan nodded, grateful for her honesty. "And I've never been good at accepting charity, so let's call it a deal. You give me work and a roof. I'll help you with whatever you need." Grace crossed her arms. "The barn needs urgent repairs. The roof's caved in at 2 spots, and the main frame's threatening to collapse. Can you handle that? I've been working with wood since I was 15. Did half the maintenance work around Seattle when money got tight. If you give me some tools, I'll figure it out." Grace studied him for another second, then nodded. "We start tomorrow, 7 sharp. Breakfast's on you." She turned and walked back toward the main house without waiting for another word. Ethan looked over at Liam, who was already inside the guest house, exploring it with the curiosity of someone who still saw magic in every new place. "I don't think she's much of a talker," the boy said. Ethan smiled, running his hand through his son's hair. "And that might just be exactly what we need right now." As the sun disappeared behind the hills and the smell of damp earth mixed with the distant sound of crickets, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Sure, the house was old. The barn looked like it could fall apart at any minute. And the woman who took them in was about as closed off as the sky on a stormy day. But even so, there was something about this land, this air, this quiet opportunity, something that said, "You're in the right place." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it. The day broke with a cold breeze and the smell of wet earth as the sun started to light up the fields of Cedar Valley in golden tones. Ethan was already awake when the rooster crowed. He hadn't slept much, but it was deep sleep, the kind that only comes when you feel safe or when you're completely worn out. He stepped out of the guest house wearing a beat-up t-shirt and jeans, toolbox in hand. Liam was still asleep, wrapped up in a blanket, his hair messy on the pillow. Outside, the morning was incredibly quiet. No cars, no sirens, no neighbors shouting. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, a bird calling in the distance, and the gentle creak of a water wheel turning. It felt like stepping into another time. Grace was already at the barn when Ethan got there. She stood with her arms crossed, frowning at the structure. She was dressed the same way she had been the day before. Leather boots, jeans, a flannel shirt. Only now her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail and there was a grease smudge on her face. Still, she looked strong. Confident, unshakable. "Thought I was gonna have to drag you out of bed," she said without taking her eyes off the barn. "I've seen worse mornings," Ethan answered with a faint smile. Grace nodded and motioned with her head. "The critical part's the center beam. If that gives out, the whole roof's coming down. I tried to prop it up with some boards by myself, but it's a miracle this barn's still standing," he said, stepping closer to assess the damage. "Compromised structure, water damage, termites in the side supports. It's going to be a lot of work. Can you do it?" Ethan looked at her seriously, then at the barn, and took a deep breath. "I can. It'll take a few days, maybe a week. But yeah, I can do it." Grace nodded without showing much emotion. "Then let's get to it." While Ethan started measuring the boards and checking the supports, Grace went over to the shed and brought back some extra tools, plus a bucket of nails, a saw, and 2 bottles of water. They worked in silence for most of the morning. Ethan sawed, hammered, and assessed everything with the kind of eye that knew every piece of wood like it was an extension of his own body. Grace, for her part, stayed close, handing him pieces, pointing out problems, helping where she could, and watching more than she spoke. Ethan noticed it. He realized she wasn't just a farmer who had inherited some old property. There was something about her, a toughness in her hands, but also something vulnerable in her eyes, like she was always waiting for the world to fall apart again. "You always handle everything on your own?" he asked, while reinforcing one of the side gate latches. Grace hesitated before answering. "Ever since my brother left. He gave up on the farm after our mother died. said it wasn't worth fighting for anymore. And you stayed? Someone had to take care of the land. Someone had to keep the family story alive. And I'm not the kind who runs from responsibility. Ethan nodded silently. He understood. Because he had stayed too. He had stayed for Liam. And he had lost everything in the process. At lunchtime, they took a break. Grace brought over 2 sandwiches and a bottle of apple juice, sitting down on the ground with her back against the outside wall of the barn. Ethan did the same. It was simple, but good. The kind of meal that fed more than just your stomach. Liam seems like a good kid, Grace said, breaking the silence. He is. Too smart for his own good. And tougher than I deserve. She nodded, looking out over the fields beyond the barn. I think you two came here for a reason. Ethan looked at her, curious. And what reason would that be? Grace didn't answer. She just gave him a small smile, the first real one he'd seen from her. Then she stood up, grabbed the hammer, and said, "Time to get back to work, Walker." And Ethan, without saying anything, just smiled back. Maybe she wasn't much for words, but she was saying everything he needed to hear. The sun was already high when Ethan finished replacing the barn's main beam. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he looked over his work, feeling a satisfaction he hadn't felt in a long time. The physical labor, the tools in his hands, the sound of the hammer striking wood. It all brought him a strange sense of normalcy. Almost like he was building more than just a wooden structure. Like he was, somehow, rebuilding himself. Liam came running a little while later, holding a piece of bread with jam, his cheeks smeared with dirt. "Dad! There's a dog here!" he shouted excitedly. "He followed me from the corral." Ethan turned and saw the animal, a big mutt with yellowish fur and sharp, watchful eyes, moving cautiously but sticking close to Liam. "The farm's got a dog now?" Ethan asked, laughing at his son's excitement. Grace appeared from the shed with a shovel in her hand, her eyes following the scene. "He showed up last week. Doesn't belong to anyone, but he hasn't left since. I guess he picked us." "Looks like he picked Liam, to be honest," Ethan said, watching the boy pet the dog with pure, genuine joy. Grace gave a half smile, then looked over at Ethan. "And the beam?" "Solid as a rock. Still a lot of work to do, but the worst part's behind us." She nodded, and the two of them walked inside the barn. The light filtering through the cracks created patterns on the wooden floor. And even with the smell of dust and hay, there was something almost sacred about the place. Old memories seemed to live within those walls, like the beams carried too many stories to be forgotten. "This barn was the first building my grandfather put up when he bought this land," Grace said suddenly, her voice low, almost reverent. "He cut the trees down himself, one by one, hauled every plank. He told me he cried the day he drove the last beam into the ground, said it was like planting roots." Ethan stayed silent. He knew those weren't words she said often. "You grew up here?" "Since I was 3 years old. When my mother died, my father took off. My grandpa raised me, taught me how to take care of the land, the animals, and not depend on anyone." She lightly touched one of the barn's support beams, the way someone touches a memory. "After he passed, I tried to keep everything the way he left it. But things change. People leave, bills pile up, and sometimes it feels like it's all useless. But you keep going," Ethan said. Grace looked at him, and for a brief moment her eyes weren't hard. They were the eyes of someone who was tired, sure, but hadn't completely lost her faith. "I keep going," she repeated. "But I don't know for how much longer." Ethan wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone, that she could count on him, at least while he was around. But the truth was, he was still trying to figure out if this place was just a stop along the way or a destination. They went back to work, each focused on their task, but something in the air had changed. A silence that wasn't so rough, so guarded. Like working side by side was building something invisible between them. A bridge, a thread. By late afternoon, with the sky painted in gold and orange, Ethan sat on the edge of the barn, watching Liam run across the field with the dog. Grace came over carrying 2 bottles of water and handed him one without saying anything. "He's happy," she said, looking at the boy. Ethan nodded. "He deserves it. After everything he's been through, he deserves a place where he can run without being scared." Grace stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "Maybe you do too." And then she turned and headed back toward the house. Ethan stayed there, watching his son and the dog disappear into the fields. The afternoon breeze ruffled his hair, and for the first time in a long time, he caught himself imagining a future that didn't involve running. A future that involved roots. Maybe he had chosen this place too, without even realizing it. The next morning, the smell of fresh coffee drifted out through the guest house window. Ethan sat at the table with a hot mug in his hands, watching Liam sleep deeply, curled up in the blanket with the new dog lying at his feet. The boy had named him Rusty, and ever since then, the two had been inseparable. Outside, the day was starting to take shape. The sky still carried the cold blue of early morning, but the first strokes of golden light were already brushing the treetops. Ethan finished his coffee, pulled on his boots, and walked over to the barn. To his surprise, Grace was already there, like always, dressed in the same simple work clothes, but wearing an expression that carried a little less weight that day. She was lifting a board to see if it could be salvaged. Even with her gloves covered in dirt and splinters, her movements were steady and sure. "You don't sleep, do you?" Ethan said, grabbing the level and starting to check the alignment of the new sidewall. Grace gave a half smile without taking her eyes off the wood. "Just enough so I don't fall flat on my face into the tractor. You should get more rest. This kind of routine, it wears you down." "And leave the farm behind? Not an option." Ethan nodded. He understood the weight of carrying something on your own, maybe even more than she realized. They spent the next few hours working together, adjusting the east wall's structure. It was heavy work, and even though Grace was stronger than most people would expect at first glance, there was something in the way she moved that gave away the accumulated exhaustion, both physical and emotional. "You ever think about hiring someone full-time?" Ethan asked, hammering a nail in. "I have. But no one sticks around for long. Working the land scares off more people than you'd think, especially when the farm belongs to a stubborn woman who doesn't smile much." Ethan let out a short laugh. "I'd say that's more charm than flaw." Grace shot him a sideways glance with an expression that almost looked like surprise. "You're the first one to say that." They kept working in silence for a few more minutes, but it was a different kind of silence than in those first few days. There was more ease, more rhythm between them. The feeling that what they were building went beyond the barn walls. When noon came, Grace stepped back and signaled with her head. "Time to stop. Come eat." "Now you're talking," Ethan said, dropping the hammer and wiping his hands on his jeans. In the kitchen of the main house, the smell of hot soup with herbs filled the air. The room was simple but cozy. Old cabinets, floral curtains, black and white photos on the walls. One of them caught Ethan's eye. It showed an older man, smiling, wearing a straw hat with a cigarette tucked into the corner of his mouth. He was standing next to a little dark-haired girl. "Your grandpa?" Ethan asked, pointing at the frame. Grace nodded, setting 2 plates on the table. "He was everything. My example, my roots. He'd be proud of what you're keeping alive here." She paused for a second, her eyes fixed on the soup, before finally sitting down at the table. "I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if he would have done things differently. Sold the place, maybe. Run from the fight. Or maybe he knew you were the only one strong enough to stay." Grace lifted her eyes, serious, and for a moment, Ethan saw something new there, something that looked like a silent thank you, a spark of relief. "And you?" she asked. "Why are you still here?" Ethan took a deep breath. It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but simple. "Because for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm running, and because my son's laughing again. That alone's worth more than any plan I ever had." Grace stared at him for a few seconds, then lowered her eyes with a brief, almost shy smile. "Well, I hope you're not leaving anytime soon. We've still got a lot of barn left to fix." Ethan raised his spoon like he was making a toast. "Don't worry, I'm already more invested in this barn than I ever was in a lot of relationships." They laughed together, for the first time lightly, naturally. And in that moment, inside that old kitchen, between 2 people who had lost so much, something was being restored. Not just the barn. Them too. The late afternoon painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as Ethan finished another part of the rebuild. The new structure of the barn was starting to take shape, sturdier, more stable. And not just in the wood. It felt like, little by little, that place was steadying something inside him too. Liam was running through the fields with Rusty, laughing loudly while the dog barked and jumped through the dry leaves. That sight alone was worth every bit of effort. Ethan was wiping his hands when he heard it. A car. Not just any car. The engine was too smooth, too quiet, and that alone set off every alarm he had. Turning slowly, he saw a shiny black luxury SUV climbing up the dirt road, its gleaming surface completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the farm. Grace heard it too. She was on the porch of the main house and quickly came down the steps, her shoulders immediately tensing up. Ethan noticed. She didn't have to say a word. That car wasn't a surprise, and it sure as hell wasn't welcome. The SUV stopped at the front gate. A man got out of the car with precise, calculated movements. Perfect suit, polished shoes, the smile of someone used to buying whatever he wanted, including respect. "Hello, Grace," he said, like they were picking up a conversation they'd paused just the night before. Grace crossed her arms. "What do you want, Victor?" Ethan moved closer, standing beside her in silence. His instincts screamed not to trust that man for a second. "I just came to make another offer," Victor Lancaster said, his voice smooth as silk. "My company's willing to double what we offered before. You know, Grace, you could live the rest of your life comfortably, no debts, no constant backbreaking work. This land, it's dying. Let it go." Grace stepped forward, her eyes burning with a firmness that didn't ask for permission. "This land is alive. It just needs people who won't give up on it," Victor sighed, like someone dealing with a stubborn child. "You're fighting something inevitable. The county's already considering selling off this whole area for development. There's no point resisting. You can leave on your own now, or you'll be forced out later." Ethan took a step forward. "You threatening her?" Victor looked him over from head to toe with polite disdain. "And you are someone who doesn't like seeing people like you playing dirty." Grace raised her hand, signaling Ethan to hold back. "Leave, Victor. Nothing you say is going to make me give up." The man adjusted his cufflinks and smiled, but there was frustration underneath it. "This is going to destroy you, Grace. Better that than living sold out." Victor got back in his car without another word. The engine purred smoothly, and in a few seconds the SUV disappeared down the road, leaving behind nothing but dust and tension. Grace stood still for a few moments, staring at the empty spot where the car had been. Then she let out a long sigh and turned to Ethan. "Sorry about that." "You don't have to apologize for standing up for what's yours," he said, calm but firm. She looked at him for a moment, and something in her eyes shifted. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was the weight of someone who had been fighting for a long time, and wasn't sure how many more rounds she could take. "They're not going to stop," she said, her voice lower now. "They're trying to buy up this whole part of the valley. I'm one of the last ones still saying no." Ethan looked out at the fields, then back at her. "Well, I'm staying, until the barn's standing, until you kick me out, or until that Victor guy tries pulling something again." Grace opened her mouth, like she was going to argue, but then just nodded. There was something different about this man, not just in what he said, but in the way he said it. He wasn't here out of interest. He was here because maybe he'd lost almost everything too, and maybe, like her, he was trying to rebuild whatever was left with his own hands. That night, sitting on the porch with the silence between them, Grace and Ethan didn't say much, but there was something new there, an unspoken pact, an alliance between two survivors, two stubborn souls, two weathered hearts. And when the wind blew, carrying the scent of earth and freshly cut hay, Ethan knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning brought a low fog, covering the valley like a thick, silent blanket. The air was damp, the ground cold under Ethan's boots as he walked toward the barn with a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. The smell of wet wood and freshly turned soil seemed like part of the daily rhythm now, and strangely enough, he was starting to like it. Liam was still asleep in the guest house, curled up next to Rusty like the dog was a living pillow. Ethan knew his boy was lighter, freer, more like a kid again. And that's all he had ever wanted to give him. A place where he could just be a kid, without having to carry the weight of all the things that were missing. At the barn, Grace was already up. Of course she was. She wore a thick sweater over her flannel shirt, and a wool cap covered part of her tied-back hair. She was leaning over one of the side logs, studying a deep crack in the wood. "Morning," Ethan said, holding out one of the mugs. She looked up and took the drink with a small nod. "Thanks. Sleep okay?" "Better than I have in months," which says a lot. "Liam seems to be settling in fast. He told me yesterday he wants to learn how to grow pumpkins," she said, taking a sip. "He's never seen a real one before, only in books. I never had enough space to even think about a garden, let alone teach him anything about it." Grace didn't answer right away. She just stared out at the field, still covered in mist. Then, in a quieter voice, she said, "Not everyone's born with space. Some of us have to build our own with our hands." Ethan stayed quiet. That sentence sounded like something she knew all too well. During the morning, they worked on the west side of the barn. The rhythm between them flowed better now. Without needing to say much, she handed him the tools, and he already knew what was needed. It was like a silent dance, a partnership built through sweat and dust. But around noon, while he was fastening a new beam high up on the structure, Ethan noticed something strange. Grace was kneeling, securing a support to the ground, but her hands were trembling, small, almost imperceptible. He climbed down the ladder slowly and approached her. "You okay?" Grace lifted her head too quickly, like she was trying to hide the moment of weakness. "I'm fine. Just haven't eaten yet. Guess breakfast didn't hold me over." Ethan didn't buy it, but he didn't want to push. Instead, he just pulled off his gloves and held out his hand. "Come on, let's eat now. The barn can wait another hour." She hesitated for a second, then accepted. They walked together to the porch of the main house, and while she made sandwiches, Ethan looked around. The room was tidy, but there were signs of exhaustion everywhere. Bills stacked up on the side table, the calendar with dates crossed out a little too hard, the sound of silence echoing between the walls. When they sat at the table, Grace seemed less rigid. Maybe it was the fatigue winning out, or maybe it was the quiet comfort Ethan's presence brought. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't try to push in. He just was there. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked carefully. Grace bit into her sandwich slowly before answering. "I have, plenty of times, especially after the bank almost took everything. And when my mom passed, I thought there was no point in staying. But leaving here would be like tearing out a piece of me. This land isn't just property. It's everything I am." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that, because ever since Rachel was gone, he felt the same, torn between leaving and staying, between running away and rebuilding. "And you?" she asked, glancing away from her plate and finally looking at him. "Why'd you leave Seattle?" The question hung there, heavy for a moment. Ethan stared at his coffee, took a deep breath, and then spoke. "My wife died 2 years ago. Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. After that, everything fell apart. I tried to keep working, take care of Liam, pay the bills, but alone, without a safety net, without support, it all just got too heavy. And eventually, you break. That's what happened to me. I broke." Grace didn't say anything, but her eyes softened, and when she reached out to grab more coffee, her fingers brushed lightly against Ethan's. It was quick, simple, but in that touch, there was more understanding than in any words they could have said. Outside, the mist was starting to lift, revealing the outline of the trees, the fences, the hills. And inside that house, 2 broken worlds were quietly starting to fit together. That night, the silence of the farm felt different. Ethan was sitting on the steps of the guest house porch with a mug of tea in his hands, the sky above him stitched with stars like you only see far away from the cities. The peace of this place was real, almost unsettling. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from the absence of problems. It was the kind that shows up even when the problems are still there. But for a moment, they don't scream so loud. Liam was already asleep, cuddled up with Rusty, and Ethan could hear the boy's steady breathing through the cracked open window. The kid was happy, and that was the hardest part, knowing that even after all the chaos, he'd still managed to keep something good alive inside his son. The light on the porch of the main house flicked on. Grace came out with a blanket draped over her shoulders and a thermos of tea in her hand. Her steps were light but steady. Without saying a word, She walked down the steps and sat beside Ethan, handing him the thermos. He took it, trading it off with his own mug. "Haven't sat out here at night in a long time," she said, looking up at the sky. "When you work from sunrise to sunset, sometimes you forget the night's there to rest, or to think," he added calmly. She glanced sideways at him. "You think too much?" "Lately, yeah. Before that, I just ran. Work, kid, bills, grief. Didn't have time to think. Thinking was dangerous, made room for feeling." Grace stayed quiet. After a while, she said, "I got used to not thinking about certain things, not remembering. It's easier to keep going when you pretend you're not carrying anything." "But you are," Ethan replied without hesitation. "And sooner or later, your body feels it. Your soul feels it." She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that night, a softer glow, a more honest kind of exhaustion. "You're the first man who's sat here with me like this, just to talk, since my grandpa died." Ethan took that in with respect. It was more than a confession. It was a key, a crack in the wall she'd spent years building. "And I'm exactly where I want to be," he said simply. Grace lowered her eyes, like it was hard for her to accept that. Like the fear of believing was bigger than the hope trying to grow inside her. "That scares me," she confessed. "You scare me, Ethan, because you don't want anything from me. And yet, you stay. Sometimes we don't stay because of what we want. We stay because deep down, we know the other person needs it. And because we need it too." The wind blew gently, and she pulled the blanket closer around herself, but she didn't move away from him. Ethan looked down at his hands, at the calluses, the small cuts from the past few days. He couldn't remember the last time he felt useful, needed, seen. "You know what's crazy?" he said, staring out across the field. "I came here thinking I was running away from everything. But ever since I arrived, it feels like, for the first time, I'm running towards something." Grace closed her eyes for a second, like those words were hard to hear, because they were too true. "And what do you think you're finding?" she asked. Ethan turned to her, and for a moment their eyes met, direct and vulnerable. "A home." Grace swallowed hard, looking away like she didn't know whether to cry or smile. She stood up, clutching the blanket tighter around her body. "Tomorrow I'll need your help checking the pasture fence. There's a section sagging." Ethan nodded, understanding what she was doing, changing the subject, shifting emotional ground. But before she went inside, he said, "Grace." She stopped on the steps, looking back over her shoulder. "When you're ready to let someone help, for real, I'm here. I'm not in a hurry." She didn't answer, but she didn't have to, because the way she stood there for a few extra seconds, taking a deep breath with her face turned toward the night, said it all. She had heard him. And more importantly, she believed him. The next day dawned warmer, with the sun burning through the morning mist and painting the fields of Cedar Valley gold. Ethan was already up before the rooster crowed, prepping tools and organizing the box of screws like each task helped quiet his mind. He hadn't slept much, not because of insomnia, but because the words from the night before kept echoing in his head. "I'm here. I'm not in a hurry." He had never said anything so simple with so much weight. Grace showed up a little later, clipboard in hand, her hair tied up in an even messier bun than usual. She wore a long-sleeved shirt with small paint stains and worn-out jeans that spoke of years of heavy work. "The north side fence is sagging," she said without beating around the bush. "Could be just rotten wood, but there are tracks there, not cow tracks. I think someone's been cutting through the property." Ethan frowned. "Someone sneaking in here?" Grace shrugged. "It's happened before. Hunters, county people surveying the land, or some random nosy folks thinking they have a right to walk through what isn't theirs." They took the old tractor and headed toward the spot she'd mentioned. As they got closer, Ethan saw it for himself. Part of the fence was definitely down, and the brush around it looked freshly trampled. He crouched down to get a better look. Boot prints, big size, recent, maybe last night. Grace stood with her arms crossed, staring hard at the broken fence. "They're getting bold. Bet it's people connected to Victor. They're testing my limits." Ethan stood up, serious. "You ever thought about putting up cameras?" "I have, but truth is, I'm just as scared of seeing who's coming in as I am of not knowing. Sometimes ignoring it feels easier." "It's not," he said firmly. Pretending you don't see what's wrong never protects you. It just isolates you. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't argue. She just grabbed a new post and started prepping the ground to reinforce the fence. They spent the next 2 hours swapping out boards, tightening screws, reinforcing weak spots. It was rough work, but there was something there Ethan was learning to recognize. The kind of shared silence between two people who didn't need to explain themselves. At one point, while they were both holding up a heavy board, their hands touched. Neither of them pulled away. Neither of them said a word. It was just a touch, brief, steady, and full of meaning. By late morning, Ethan was sitting under the shade of a nearby tree, drinking water while Grace stared out at the fields. She seemed distant in that moment, like she was talking to ghosts, only she could see. "Do you think it's still possible?" she asked suddenly. Ethan looked at her, confused. Possible for what? She turned her face toward him, meeting his eyes. To start over, to trust, to stop feeling like you're always at war with everything. The question caught Ethan off guard, because he thought about it almost every day, but never had the guts to say it out loud. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I think if there's any place it could happen, it's here." Grace bit the corner of her lip, like she was trying to hold something in. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "When I was little, my grandpa used to say that some trees still grow even in dry soil, because sometimes what feeds the roots isn't the ground, it's the will to stay standing." Ethan smiled, lowering his head. "Your grandpa was a wise man." "He was," Grace said, a spark lighting up in her eyes. "And he was even more stubborn than me." Lunch that day felt lighter. Grace made pancakes with fresh honey, and Liam, his face a sticky mess, swore it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. Ethan laughed as he wiped the boy's face with a dish towel, and even Grace let out a soft chuckle at the scene. Later, while Liam and Rusty played out in the field, Grace sat next to Ethan on the porch of the main house. The sun was starting to sink, painting the horizon in soft shades of pink and gold. "I keep trying to understand," she said, "how someone who showed up by accident can shake up a routine that took years to build." Ethan looked at her kindly. Maybe it wasn't by accident. She turned her face slowly, and their eyes met. There were no promises there, no declarations. But there was something rarer, truth. And sometimes, that's exactly what a new beginning needs. The weather started to turn by the end of the afternoon. First came the wind, stronger than usual, shaking the trees like it was trying to wake the valley from a deep sleep. Then the heavy clouds appeared on the horizon, stacking up like gray walls. Ethan was in the shed organizing tools when he felt the first blast of cold air cut across the field. This wasn't just a regular breeze. It was a warning. Grace showed up at the door of the shed, her face tense, eyes locked on the dark sky rolling in. "There's a big storm coming," she said bluntly. "I've seen this kind before. Strong winds, hail, maybe even lightning." Ethan nodded and dropped what he was doing. "What do you need?" "Tie down the tarp over the tractors, lock up the feed shed, protect the horses. And we need to check the barn. If the roof gives under strong wind, the whole structure could collapse." Without wasting time, they split up. Ethan ran to the back to pull the tarps over the machinery, while Grace gathered ropes and reinforcements to tie the doors shut. The sky was darkening at an abnormal speed, like the sun had been ripped from the sky. Liam came running out of the guest house, Rusty right on his heels. "Dad, it's getting dark. What's happening?" Ethan crouched down, scooping the boy up firmly. "It's just a big storm, it'll pass, but I need you to stay inside the house with the dog. Lock the door and don't come out until we're back, okay?" Liam nodded, scared but obedient. Ethan handed him over to Grace for a second, and she led him to the porch, speaking with a calmness that contradicted the fear thickening in the air. Minutes later, the first drops began to fall, heavy as bullets, hammering against the barn's roof. Ethan and Grace ran inside, quickly inspecting the beams, the reinforced joints, the fittings. "Will it hold?" she shouted over the noise of the rain. "If the wind doesn't shift from the south, yeah. But if it does, we'll have to be here to brace the doors." And as if the sky had heard them, a howling gust of wind ripped across the hills, making the barn creak with a crack loud enough to freeze them both for a second. Grace ran to one of the windows and saw the corral gate bursting open under the force of the wind. "The cows!" she yelled. "If they scatter, we'll lose half the herd." Ethan was already running out, his raincoat flapping against his body as he bolted toward the open field. Water was already up to his ankles, and the mud made every step a battle. Grace followed without hesitation. Together, they fought against the force of the wind, guiding the animals back with shouts and clapping, using their bodies to steer them. Ethan almost fell, slipping into a ditch, but Grace grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't you dare die on me, Walker," she yelled through the storm. "Not planning on it." It took them nearly 20 minutes, but they did it. Soaked to the bone, covered in mud, exhausted but alive, and with all the animals safely back under shelter. Back in the barn, they leaned against the wall, panting, while the wind still howled, though a little further away now. Outside, the storm was slowly moving off. But inside, something had changed between them. Grace lowered her head, her hair dripping over her face. "I thought I was going to lose everything," she whispered. Again. Ethan stepped closer, no rush, just close enough so she could feel he was there. "You're not alone in this anymore." She lifted her eyes slowly. They were red, not from crying, but from everything she carried inside. Pain, anger, fear, and something that looked a lot like hope. "I don't know how to share this," she confessed. "This place, this life, I learned to carry it all by myself." Ethan nodded. Then he reached out and lightly touched her fingers, not gripping. "We start like this, slow, no promises, just staying." For a moment, she left her hand there. Then she intertwined her fingers with his. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Outside, the thunder finally faded, and inside, in the silence after the storm, a new route was quietly beginning to take hold. The next day dawned drenched, with low-hanging clouds hovering over the fields and puddles of water reflecting the gray sky. The silence after the storm felt almost strange, like the farm was holding its breath. Broken branches, crooked fences, the dried mud on their boots, everything was a reminder of the night before. Ethan woke up sore all over. Every muscle in his body reminded him that he'd spent the night fighting wind, mud, and panicked animals. But even so, he got up feeling lighter. Something had changed, and not just in the farm structure. Liam was still asleep, and Rusty was snoring at the foot of the bed, completely wiped out. Ethan stepped outside to find Grace already up, as always, assessing the damage with that same look she always wore. Steady, focused, but now, a little less lonely. "South fence is down," she said as soon as he got close, "and a branch hit the porch eaves. Gonna need fixing." "Tell me what to do," he answered, pulling on his gloves. Grace gave him a quick look. It wasn't a commanding look. It was an allied one. While they worked, the sound of an engine approaching made them both pause. It wasn't the rumble of a tractor or the whine of a local truck. It was a sound too familiar. A black SUV slid down the dirt road, slow and smug. Ethan already knew what was coming. Grace dropped the hammer with a sigh, visibly tense. "He's back." Victor Lancaster stepped out of the car like he was walking into a boardroom and not a muddy farm. He wore another expensive suit, shiny shoes already stained with mud after just 2 steps. Still, he kept that same calculated smile. "Grace," he said, opening his arms like he was actually welcome. "Good to see the storm didn't wipe everything out." Yet. Ethan stepped forward, instinctively putting himself between them, but Grace touched his arm lightly to stop him. "What do you want, Victor?" "I already said no. I came to give you one last chance to do this the easy way," he said, pulling a folder from the car. "The county approved the project. If you don't sign, they can use eminent domain." "You're not going to win this fight, Grace." She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "That's blackmail. That's politics, my dear. The decisions are already being made. You can walk away with dignity and a nice paycheck, or you can be forced out without warning. It's up to you." Ethan felt his blood boil. He stepped forward. "You think you can just come here, push around a woman who's kept this place standing by herself for years, and call it a favor?" Victor laughed, but there was nothing friendly in it, only contempt. "And you, the new farmhand? You think you're going to change anything?" "I don't have to change anything," Ethan said firmly. "I just have to stay, because unlike you, I see value where you only see profit. Victor snapped the folder shut. You'll regret this. Maybe, but at least we'll regret it standing tall, Grace said without flinching. The SUV disappeared into the dust and the tension that hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They're gonna come at us hard, Ethan, she finally said, her voice low. They'll use laws, numbers, influence, and all I've got is old land, stubbornness, and you. He turned to her. And that's more than enough, because you know what else you've got? She raised an eyebrow, curious. Roots, deep ones. And when a root is strong enough, not even the strongest wind can tear it out. She stared at him, serious. Then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled for real. Not a sad smile, not a defensive one. A clean, honest smile that said, "Thank you," without a single word. Later, sitting on the porch, Ethan and Grace watched Liam feeding the chickens, Rusty running around him in circles. The sky was finally clearing, and a patch of blue broke through the clouds. You really think we can beat this? She asked without looking at him. I think you've already beaten the hardest part, standing when everything told you to fall. She took a deep breath, sipped her coffee, and said, Then we fight. Together. And for the first time, she didn't try to correct him, didn't try to push him away. She just accepted it. On the farm, silence settled in again. But it wasn't a lonely silence anymore. It was the silence of a home being built. 2 days had passed since Victor Lancaster's last visit, and time seemed to have slowed down, like the farm itself was holding its breath before the next storm. Literal or not. The sky stayed unstable, but there was a truce, and in that quiet pause, a lot was being repaired. The barn's roof, the southern fence, the porch eaves, but there were also more subtle things being mended. Things you couldn't see, but could feel. Ethan and Grace already worked like a team. She set the tools aside before he even asked. He could tell when she needed a minute to herself. The silences between them stopped being uncomfortable. They started to feel companionable. That morning, Ethan was kneeling on the dirt floor of the shed, adjusting the fitting of one of the new posts. Grace showed up at the door with 2 mugs of hot tea and a package of homemade cookies. Am I interrupting? She asked, raising her eyebrows. Only if there's sugar in those cookies, he said, getting up with a slight smile. There is. And butter. My grandma's recipe. They sat down on a stack of lumber, mugs in hand. The sun peeked through breaks in the clouds, lighting up part of the makeshift workshop. There was dust, the smell of cut wood, tools scattered around. But there was also peace. A kind of peace Ethan didn't remember ever feeling anywhere else. Ever thought about turning this place into something bigger? He asked, gesturing toward the shed. Like what? A woodworking shop. A real one. You've got space, raw materials. You could make furniture, sell handmade pieces. There's a lot of people who appreciate that kind of thing these days. And you've got too much history in this place to keep it hidden. Grace considered the idea for a moment. Never thought anyone would see this as anything more than an old storage shed. I see a lot of things here you don't see yet, he said, sincere. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and discomfort. Not because she doubted him, but because she wasn't used to receiving that kind of faith. Have you always been like this? She asked after a while. Like what? The kind of man who sees what's under the cracks. Ethan gave a sad smile. Not always. Took me a long time to learn how to look past the obvious. Lost a lot before I did. Grace nodded, understanding more than she said. Her fingers played with the rim of the mug. Then, almost shyly, she said, Before all this, before the farm became this constant battle, I used to dream about opening a greenhouse with flowers. My mom loved dahlias. It was the one place on the farm that always felt happy. Ethan tilted his head, curious. Why don't you? She shrugged. Because dreaming takes time and energy, and I spent both just trying not to lose what little I had left. He stayed quiet for a moment, then said, Maybe now you've got someone to share that energy with. Grace looked away, like she was hearing a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to accept. But the slight lift at the corner of her mouth said more than any words. That afternoon, Liam came running in with an idea, like every determined 7-year-old who thinks they can change the world with a piece of paper and some tape. Dad, Grace, I want to build a house for Rusty. with windows and everything," he announced proudly, holding up a crayon-sketched blueprint. Ethan laughed, kneeling down to look at the plans. "Wow, that's almost a castle." "It can be a castle, with a flag and everything." Grace watched from a distance, arms crossed, but she couldn't hide her smile. It was rare to see kids running around there, rare to hear laughter echoing across the fields. "Can I help?" she asked, taking the paper from Liam's hand. The boy's eyes widened in surprise. "You know how to make windows?" "I know how to make windows, roofs, and secret doors." Ethan raised his eyebrows, pretending to be shocked. "You never told me you could build secret doors. Some things you save for special moments." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, cutting pieces of scrap wood, painting with old cans of paint they found in the shed, and hammering boards together with more enthusiasm than precision. The little house turned out crooked. The flag was made from an old dishcloth, but Rusty loved it, and so did Liam. And for a moment, Ethan watched Grace kneeling beside the boy, laughing with paint smudged on her face, and he thought, this is how it starts, not with promises, but with little things being built together. And maybe, just maybe, what they were building wasn't just a doghouse. It was a life. The next morning, the breeze was crisp, and the smell of coffee mixed with the scent of wet earth and freshly cut wood. Rusty's crooked, colorful little house still stood proudly in the yard, like an improvised monument to what truly mattered: simplicity, care, and connection. Ethan was in the shed reorganizing tools when he heard the distinct sound of thin tires crunching the gravel road. But this time, it wasn't Victor's black SUV. It was a smaller car, sleek, way too polished for these parts. When he looked out the window, he saw a woman step out of the vehicle in high heels, a beige blazer, and sunglasses way too big for her face. He muttered. This can't be good. Grace appeared right after, wiping her hands on a rag, frowning as she caught sight of the visitor. "Rachel?" she said, visibly surprised. The woman took off her sunglasses delicately and smiled with perfectly painted red lips. "Grace, I'd still recognize you under all this rustic charm." Ethan raised an eyebrow. This promised to be interesting. "Who's that?" he asked under his breath. "Rachel Whitaker," Grace answered shortly. "Victor's sister." Ethan narrowed his eyes, now understanding why that smile looked so rehearsed. Rachel walked carefully down the stone path, stepping around the mud like she was crossing a minefield. "I came to talk, without my brother around. I know he can be a bit too forceful." Grace crossed her arms, her body steady as always. "What do you want?" "A deal, woman to woman." She smiled sweetly, too sweetly. "The project's moving forward. The county board votes in 2 days. But there's still room for concessions. You give up part of the land, keep the house, maybe the shed. In return, you get a nice payout, some security, and you avoid a lawsuit that'll drain everyone, especially you." Grace let out a short, humorless laugh. "And why do you care?" "Because unlike my brother, I know how to recognize value when I see it." Rachel looked around, as if she could see more than just mud and old wood. "This place has soul. I respect that. But business is business." Ethan stepped forward. "This isn't a negotiation. It's pressure with polite varnish." Rachel looked at him, her tone still calm. "And you are someone who's not going to let Grace face this alone." She studied Ethan for a moment, then turned back to Grace. "Think carefully. Leaving with something in your hands is better than leaving empty-handed. A smart woman knows when it's time to walk away. A smart woman also knows when someone's trying to sweet-talk her into giving up," Grace answered, her eyes cold as steel. Rachel put her sunglasses back on, adjusted her purse on her shoulder, and before leaving said, "I tried to do this the right way. I just hope that when you look back, you won't regret being so inflexible." And then she left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and empty promises. Grace stood still for a few seconds, watching the car disappear down the road. "They're really playing dirty," she said at last. Ethan walked up slowly, his voice calm. "They think you're alone, that you can be bent with threats disguised as kindness. And maybe they could, if I really was alone. But you're not." He looked straight at her. "And that changes everything." She turned slowly to him. She didn't say anything, but something in her eyes said that, at that moment, a decision had been made, silent, firm, irreversible. Later, as they painted the fence that had been damaged by the wind, Grace paused for a moment, resting her brush on the paint bucket. "Do you see me as weak?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He put down what he was doing, wiping his hands. "No, never. Even when I think about giving up?" He stepped closer. "Thinking about giving up isn't weakness, Grace. It's human. But choosing to keep going anyway, that's real strength." She nodded slowly. Then she looked out over the field, where Liam was running with Rusty, as if the world was still a safe place. "For him, and for me, I'm not selling. Not part. Not half. They'll have to run over me to take this." Ethan smiled slightly. "Good to know, because now they'll have to get through me too." That night, the dinner table was fuller. Grace made spicy chili, and Liam made a mess of himself eating it. They laughed together, toasted with glasses of juice and beer, and for a moment, the war outside felt distant, but they knew it was just beginning. The next morning, the weather was warmer, but it wasn't just the sun heating the air in Cedar Valley. It was the atmosphere inside the house, in the barn, across the fields. It was as if everything was humming with a different rhythm, more intense, more alive, as if the very ground knew something important was about to happen. The notice came early. An official letter from the county, delivered by a messenger dressed far too formally for that piece of the world. The hearing that would decide the future of Grace's property would be in 48 hours, and the representatives from Whitaker Developments had already filed a new request for eminent domain to seize part of the land. Grace read the paper in silence. She didn't crumple it. She didn't tear it up. She just folded it carefully and placed it on the kitchen table. "It's happening," she said, her voice firm. "They've declared war." Ethan didn't answer right away. He knew this was a crucial moment, the kind where the right words needed to be chosen carefully, like seeds cast into fertile soil. "Then it's time to show them this land has people willing to fight for it." Grace looked at him, and there was no more doubt in her eyes. That day, they worked like they were preparing for more than just a hearing. It felt like they were raising an invisible army, made of history, of effort, of memory. Grace pulled out old documents, photos of her grandfather working the fields, handwritten letters from her grandmother, receipts from the community market where she used to donate part of her crops. Everything that could prove this land wasn't just property. It was a legacy. Ethan sprang into action on another front. He called contacts from his old woodworking days in Seattle, asked for help putting together a visual presentation of the barn, the workshop, the potential for a sustainable business on the land. Showed that there were plans, a future, jobs to be created. Meanwhile, Liam, curious, watched them. And during one of those pauses, when Ethan stopped to catch his breath, the boy tugged at his hand. "Dad, is Grace gonna lose everything?" Ethan knelt down beside him and answered honestly, "We're not gonna let that happen, son. We're gonna fight the right way." "Can I help?" he asked, his big eyes full of determination. Ethan smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Just you being here helps more than you know." That afternoon, Grace decided to call on the few neighbors who were left, people who knew the farm, who bought her eggs, who helped with the harvest, or came to her for planting advice. It was a small community, but it still existed. "If I'm going to speak in court," she said, "I don't want to speak just for myself. I want them to hear other voices too." They set everything up for a gathering on the porch. Ethan arranged chairs, fixed the lighting, set up a table with juice and cakes made by Grace, who, even at war, still knew how to host with hospitality. 7 neighbors came, 7 simple souls, hands marked by years with the plow, hearts rooted in that land. "Grace, you kept this valley standing when no one else stayed," said Mr. Harlan, an old man with a white beard and a straw hat. "We're not going to let them take it now." A lady named Dolores brought an envelope full of photos taken more than 20 years ago, back when the farm hosted community picnics. "You taught me how to make preserves. This land taught me how to live slow. That's worth something, Grace." And each person left something. A note, a testimony, a memory. Ethan watched it all in silence, a lump in his throat. That evening, with golden light filtering through the trees and the fields glowing with the hope of those who don't give up easily, Grace finally spoke. "They think this is just land, but this is what keeps us alive. It's what teaches us to keep going. And now, it's our turn to teach them what can't be bought. And then she turned to Ethan, her voice lower, just for him. You still with me in this? Ethan didn't hesitate. All the way. Grace nodded. And it was just a small gesture. But right there, among silent promises and alliances forged in mud and heart, an army was forming. Small, yes, but invincible in the only way that matters. They knew what they were fighting for. The sun had barely risen when Ethan woke up that Thursday morning. The farm was silent, like even the roosters had decided to respect what the day meant. It wasn't just another day among crops and fences. It was the day Grace would stand face to face against the system that had been trying to tear out her roots. Liam was still sleeping. Ethan looked at the boy for a moment before leaving the room, straightened the collar of his clean shirt, and pulled on his boots with more purpose than usual. That morning wasn't about working the land. It was about fighting in the city's back rooms. In the kitchen of the main house, Grace was already ready. She wore dark jeans, a light blue button-down shirt, her hair tied back in a simple bun. No makeup, no jewelry, just herself. And yet Ethan thought he had never seen her look so strong. She took a sip of coffee and lifted her eyes. Ready? Ready, he said without hesitation. During the drive to the administrative center of River Hollow, the town where the hearing would be held, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was focused. Ethan drove, his eyes steady on the dirt road that slowly gave way to pavement, while Grace stared out the window, watching the fields she was about to defend with everything she had. When they arrived at the county building, there was more commotion than they'd expected. Journalists, lawyers, company reps, and the neighbors. The 7 who had gathered on Grace's porch were there, holding up simple signs that said things like, "Preserve the roots," and "This land has a name, a history, a rightful owner." Grace stood still for a few seconds, overwhelmed by their presence. Then she walked up to each one of them, greeting them with hugs and quiet words of thanks. Inside the hearing room, the benches were almost full. Up front sat Victor Lancaster, dressed in a gray suit, his eyes cold, and his sister Rachel, sitting next to a lawyer who smiled a little too much to be trustworthy. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression, called the case. Petition for recognition of eminent domain over part of the Hastings farm. Victor was the first to speak. With carefully chosen words, he presented maps, numbers, promises of investment, jobs, and development. Everything polished, everything beautiful on paper. Your Honor, this is an opportunity to revitalize a stagnant area. Grace Hastings does not represent growth. She represents resistance to something inevitable. Ethan clenched his fists but stayed silent. Then it was Grace's turn. She walked to the center of the room with a stack of papers in her hand. Her posture as straight as a well-planted fence. Your Honor, this land is more than lines on a map. It feeds families. It produces real food, not promises. Here's the proof, she said, handing over documents with real numbers on production, distribution, and sustainable projects. She continued, but more than that, this land represents something most people have forgotten. The value of belonging to a place, of taking care of it, of getting up every day, rain or shine, and giving back to what sustains us. There was a soft murmur of approval in the room. Then she presented the written testimonies from her neighbors. She read one of the notes aloud. Without this farm, my table would have been empty many times. She taught me how to plant, how to harvest, and how to believe that the land still has value. Signed, Dolores Everett. The room fell silent. Finally, she said, I know I don't have millions to offer, but I have roots. And roots, Your Honor, are the only thing that keeps the land from turning to dust in the wind. Ethan almost forgot to breathe. That wasn't just a defense, it was a manifesto, a truth so big that no cold courtroom could ever contain it. When the judge called for a recess to deliberate, Grace returned to her seat. Ethan discreetly touched her hand. You were brilliant. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, but steady. I just told the truth. Minutes later, everyone returned to the room. The judge read the verdict clearly. The petition for recognition of eminent domain over the Hastings farm is denied. A brief murmur rippled through the room. There is not sufficient evidence that the benefits outweigh the direct impact on the property and its historical and economic contribution. The land remains under full ownership of the current owner. Victor stood up with an irritated smirk at the corner of his lips, adjusted his jacket, and walked out of the room without a word. Rachel followed close behind, with far less arrogance than she had walked in with. Ethan turned to Grace. She didn't say anything, but her eyes, full of silent tears, said it all. She had won, and she wasn't alone. The ride back home was different. The sky looked bluer, the trees greener. Even Ethan's old truck seemed to glide more easily over the dirt road. But it wasn't a ride filled with loud celebration. It was silent. That kind of silence that's full of relief, full of meaning. Grace stared out the window, her eyes distant, as if still processing the victory. Her hands rested in her lap, still, but Ethan noticed her fingers trembling slightly. He respected that silence until they were just about to turn the curve that revealed the open fields of the farm. "Looks different," he said, nodding toward it. "It does." Her voice came out low, like she was afraid of breaking the moment. "But it's not the land that changed. It's me." Ethan parked the truck in front of the main house. For a second, they sat there, watching Rusty and Liam running in the distance, playing with an old tire swing hanging from a tree. "They're not going to come back anytime soon, right?" she asked. "Maybe they will," Ethan said. "But now they know you're not alone." He looked at her calmly. "And that this land has people who'll fight for it." Grace nodded and got out of the truck slowly. She walked up to the porch, kicked off her muddy boots, and went inside. Ethan stayed outside for a moment, watching the door close behind her, before heading over to the shed where everything had started for him. As he organized tools and wiped down the workbench, he thought about everything that had happened. From a lost man on a road with no cell service to a silent partner in a war for a forgotten farm. Forgotten by almost everyone, except the ones who truly mattered. A little while later, Liam came running into the workshop, hands dirty with soil and eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, Grace said I can help plant the seeds for the greenhouse with her. We're going to start a dahlia garden." Ethan smiled, crouching down to wipe the boy's face with a rag. "Dahlias, huh? Good choice." She said it was her mom's favorite flower, and now it's going to be ours too. Liam sprinted back toward the fields, and Ethan stayed there for a few seconds, letting the word sink in. Ours. A simple word. But it carried everything. Later, as the sun began setting and the golden light painted the porch, Ethan found Grace sitting in the rocking chair with a glass of tea in her hands. She was barefoot, feet resting on the warm wooden floor, her eyes lost in the sky that was starting to change colors. "You know," she said without turning to look at him, "for so long, I thought my worth came from not giving in, from being stronger than everyone, from never asking for help." "Doesn't it?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "No." She turned to face him, her eyes peaceful. "Real worth comes from knowing when it's time to make room, to let someone in, to let the roots spread, not just down, but sideways too. Growth needs connection." Ethan stayed silent. She had figured it out, and the beautiful thing was, he hadn't forced any of it. She had gotten there on her own. But he was there to witness it, to stay. "I'm thinking about completely rebuilding the barn," she continued. "Not just patching it up, transforming it, making a real workshop. Maybe even starting a little farmer's market at the entrance on Saturdays. Bring people back. Make this place really live again." "And the greenhouse?" he asked with a soft smile. "Already started the sketch. Liam's going to help with the colors." The breeze blew gently, rustling the branches. There was a new smell in the air, a mix of damp earth, dry wood, and possibility. Then Grace turned to him with a look softer than any he had ever seen. A look that didn't ask for explanations, didn't ask for promises. "You still thinking about leaving?" she asked. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze steady on hers. "No, I only ever thought about leaving because I didn't know yet, that I was already home." She didn't answer. She just reached out her hand over his. No rush, no doubt. And this time, it wasn't him who held on first. It was her. 2 weeks had passed since the day of the hearing. Time seemed to move differently after the victory. Not just the weather, but the very breathing of the farm. What used to be survival was slowly becoming rebuilding, planning, living. The main house's windows gleamed with fresh polish. The fences had been repainted with the neighbors' help, and the barn, now solid and sturdy, had a makeshift sign crafted by Ethan and Liam. Root Workshop. It was the name Liam had chosen, with the kind of wisdom only a child could have. Because everything strong has roots, he explained, his hands covered in paint and his eyes full of pride. The idea for the Saturday market was taking shape. Grace, who once hesitated even to open up to her own feelings, was now organizing a list with the neighbors. Fresh eggs, jams, vegetables, handcrafted woodwork, potted flowers. Ethan had set up a small workbench in the shed to make benches, cutting boards, even wooden toys, all from scraps left over from the barn's rebuild. They weren't just rebuilding a place, they were giving it a new purpose, a new heart. On a particularly clear morning, Grace showed up in the field carrying a wooden box. Ethan was cutting boards and paused when he saw her. "What's that?" She opened the lid and showed him. Seeds, dahlias, tomatoes, basil, sunflowers. "It's time to plant the greenhouse," she said, with a lightness in her voice he had never heard before. "Not to sell, just because I want to see something bloom again." He nodded and set down his tools. He walked with her to the fenced-off patch they had reserved weeks before, where Grace had marked the ground with ropes and stakes. They worked side by side all day, digging holes, mixing the soil with compost, watering carefully. Liam helped too, sinking his hands into the dirt like he instinctively understood that planting was an act of faith. By the end of the afternoon, dirty and sweaty, the three of them were lying on the grass, staring up at the sky as it began to change colors. "I thought I'd never feel peace again," Grace said softly. "Peace doesn't come all at once," Ethan replied. "It comes in pieces, one moment at a time." She turned her face toward him, lying on her side. "And you? I thought I'd never feel whole again. But you in this place showed me that you can rebuild even what you can't see." Grace ran her hand through his hair gently. A simple gesture, intimate, fearless. Later that same night, the farm was silent under the moonlight. Ethan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. Not because he was tired, but because he was grateful. Grace came out wearing an old sweatshirt and carrying a blanket draped over her shoulders. "I thought you'd be asleep by now," she said, sitting next to him. "Can't sleep easy when your heart's full." "Full of what?" He smiled. "Of you, of Liam, of the workshop, of the greenhouse, of this good kind of quiet, of everything that makes me want to stay." She leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time, not saying a word, because some things don't need to be explained, just felt. And there, under the Texas stars, two souls who once arrived broken found a place where they could finally bloom. Months had passed since the hearing. Spring was now bursting across the fields of Cedar Valley. The farm, once tired and struggling, was flourishing like never before. Colors returned, sounds returned, life returned. The Saturday market had become a weekly event. Neighbors from nearby counties started showing up. Families with kids, old folks with straw hats, young people snapping photos next to the new sign at the entrance that now read, "Hastings Farm, where roots meet." Grace walked among the stalls like someone who had found her purpose again. Her hands were still strong, but now they knew how to welcome. Her smile wasn't just from someone who survived. It was from someone who had won and allowed the victory to change her. Ethan kept the workshop buzzing. His woodworking bench had become a favorite stop for visitors. Kids were enchanted by the handmade toys, and parents ordered rustic benches for their porches. He created, laughed, taught, and at the end of the day, he would head out to the fields to see the greenhouse, now filled with rows of fire-red dahlias. There, among clay pots and the scent of fresh basil, Grace was building more than just a garden. She was building a new beginning. Liam, for his part, had almost become the farm's official guide. He proudly showed visitors his doghouse, told stories about the horses, the chickens, the barn that Dad fixed with his own hands. And Rusty, of course, was the star of it all, wagging his tail, floppy ears bouncing, like he knew he was part of the story too. One golden afternoon, as the sun slowly spilled across the sky, Grace and Ethan sat on the porch. The sounds of the market still floated on the breeze, but the moment belonged to just them. "You know, I never thought I'd get here," she said with a soft smile, her eyes locked on the glowing fields. "Here where? In a life where I don't have to fight every day just to keep standing. In a space where I can just live." Ethan intertwined his fingers with hers. "And the best part is, you didn't do it alone." She looked at him. There was so much in her eyes now. Softness, trust, love. "I know." He took a deep breath. "Grace Hastings, you taught me not every storm comes to destroy. Some come to prepare the ground." She smiled, emotional. "And you, Ethan Walker, you taught me that making room for someone in your life isn't weakness, it's wisdom." He leaned in and kissed her, slowly, with the beautiful calm of someone who had hurt too much to ever rush again. The kiss wasn't the climax of the story. It was simply the confirmation that what had started as an accident had become a choice, that what had been born from pain had bloomed into healing, and that the two of them, even so different, had found fertile ground in each other. And then, like every good ending that is really just a new beginning, Liam came running across the porch with a sheet of paper in his hand. "Dad! Grace! Look at the picture I drew of the farm." They crouched beside him and saw, scribbled in crayon, a big house, a red barn, a greenhouse bursting with flowers, and 3 people holding hands, smiling, next to a floppy-eared dog. Grace touched the drawing delicately. "That's how you see us?" "Uh-huh," Liam said. "We're like a root family." Ethan and Grace exchanged a look. Yes, that's exactly what they were. A family born from the earth, from pain, from courage, and they had grown roots deep enough to never be torn out again.